Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Kevin Gallagher on the subject of global financial regulation. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week on the show, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of external affairs here to the studio in Waterloo. Today, my guest is Dr. Kevin Gallagher. Dr. Gallagher is an associate professor of global development policy at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. He's also the co-director of the Global Economic Governance Initiative and the Global Development Policy Programs. He's also the author of a new book that came out in 2014, published by Cornell University Press, Ruling Capital, Emerging Markets, and the Re-Regulation of Cross-Border Finance. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the book. And I thought we'd start by setting the landscape. Going back to 2008, 2009, what was the regulatory framework governing global finance like?
Well, I want to go back even a little further than that to the 1990s, where the dominant way of thinking in the economic profession, which was mimicked at the International Monetary Fund and other international financial institutions, was that cross-border financial flows, derivatives, bonds, stocks, and so forth, bank loans and so forth, were essential for the development of emerging market and developing economies. We didn't call them emerging markets then, we just called them developing economies. Because emerging markets or developing economies were developing essentially because they didn't have enough investment. And if they opened up their doors to investment, the idea at the time was let it flow and they will grow. Economies absorb the investment and they would be able to put it to full use. And so any kind of regulation on the cross-border transactions of financial flows was considered inherently distortionary that would hurt the economy. If they even worked. A lot of folks didn't even think that they worked. And that was the dominant paradigm in the 1990s, so much so that there was a move at the International Monetary Fund to actually require that every country in the world open up its financial flows to the rest of the world. That stopped because of the Asian financial crisis, which was largely a function of premature opening of capital accounts, the section of your balance of payments that allows financial flows to come in and out. And also due to some hard work of say U.S. congresspersons and some non-governmental organizations, because of course the U.S. has veto power and was largely behind the move until the last minute. Right. So fast forward to 2008, 2009, when the crisis hit in the United States and in New York. Right. Ironically, there was so much fear in the world markets that money retreated from everywhere in the world and came back to the United States. Seems odd, but we do hold the dollar, and we, knock on wood, have never defaulted on our loans, and the United States was seen as a safe haven for global financial markets. Well, that spelled doom for a lot of emerging market and developing countries. That they had received lots of financial flows, short-term financial flows into their economies from 2002 till 2007 or so, and then all of a sudden it started to bleed out. And when financial flows leave your economy, your currency depreciates because there's less demand for the goods and services and investment possibilities in your economy. Well, when you get massive currency depreciation and you owe a lot of money in international dollars, that means you have to come up with that much more real, that much more yuan to pay them back. Right. Countries started to panic that that's what would make the crisis that started in the North Atlantic become a global one. And indeed, that was the channel. But this time, something different happened. Countries said, we're going to regulate this stuff to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Now, in your book, you make the case that emerging and developing economies are really leading the charge for re-regulation and have been doing so since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. What specifically are they trying to accomplish, and what are the principal priorities that they have?
Sure. Well, what we've learned is that these short-term financial flows are very fickle, and they're what we call pro-cyclical. There's lots of them when things are going well, and it disappears when things are going bad. Okay. And the big driver of what causes cross-border financial flows to go into emerging market and developing countries are industrialized country monetary policies, especially the United States federal funds rate. Okay. And so after the crisis, when the United States lowered the interest rate to try to kick off investment back in the United States, the U.S. economy still wasn't doing so well. So investors looked at the U.S. economy and said, I'm not going to give you any money to open up a new, we're here at the Seagram's plant, open up a new whiskey bottling company. You know what I'm going to do, what's a much better bet for me, is we've got zero interest rates in the United States. Brazil's interest rate's 12%. South Korea's interest rate is 7%. Chile's interest rate is 8%. I can borrow money super cheap in the United States and buy currency or buy stocks or buy short-term bonds in any one of those economies and immediately make that interest rate spread. This is a much bigger profit than any kind of consideration of real economy kind of investments in the U.S. So there was a lot of international speculation, made these hedge funds and Wall Street firms much better off because of it. However, while it fueled short-term growth in the emerging markets, it also pushed their interest rates up. Pushed their exchange rates up, which made some of their goods and services less competitive in their economy. And as the economies of the world started to push out, 2008, 2009, 2010, this exchange rate appreciation put a bite on growth. And these capital flows, the subsequent exchange rate appreciation, and the big amounts of debt that they took on during that period is one of the reasons now why the emerging markets are slowing down and the industrialized countries are going up. Emerging markets looked at this environment and said, we're overheating, and we need to put regulations in place to stem the more speculative short-term financial flows, the stocks, the bonds, the foreign exchange derivatives, and steer it into new bottling plants, new auto companies, and so forth. They weren't against foreign investment. They just wanted to be more of a long-term nature into infrastructure, manufacturing, and not into short-term stocks and bonds that didn't have a huge impact on the everyday workings of their economy.
And how successful have they been in pushing for some of these new regulations? Are there specific victories that they've had?
Yeah, what's amazing is that countries all across the world put in place these regulations: Brazil, South Korea, Indonesia, Taiwan, India. China has a permanent set of them in place. And a number of studies, including studies that I did for my book, have shown that these regulations worked. There's a new consensus now that those countries that regulate the inflow of capital during these massive surges were among those that were the least hard hit during the financial crisis. And
now you also argue in your book that these emerging economies are having an influence on international organizations like the IMF and the G20. How are these institutions being affected by this?
Sure. Well, a lot of these countries were doing these actions at home.
Right.
And when they used to do this kind of stuff or talk about it in the 1990s, the IMF would parachute in and say, that's a no-no, and you don't want to get rebuked by the IMF because it could affect your credit rating and have impacts on investment and so forth. And they were really concerned about how the IMF would react. And they literally called up Dominique Strauss-Kahn and said, we're putting in all these regulations. How are you going to react? Well, it just so happened after the financial crisis that the IMF was trying to reestablish itself in the world economy. It had fallen out of favor after the Asian financial crisis and was looking to reposition itself. And when Strauss-Kahn saw that countries wanted to put in place these kinds of regulations, he said he had just given a big speech at the IMF to staff to say, we need to think out of the box here. And a deputy researcher at the IMF had just published an internal study that I just referred to that showed that those countries that regulated the inflow of capital in the emerging world were among those least hard hit by the crisis. Right. He saw the study and he elevated it. He had a big public symposium inside the IMF, and they released it. It got lots of press around the world. Some countries were quite concerned about the press that it got, especially the United States was worried that the IMF was going to go tell countries to regulate capital flows all around the world. And what happened was they decided to have a process to reevaluate how the IMF deals with capital flows and regulating capital flows that lasted from 2010 to 2012. Right. And there was a big battle there. I guess you would say that since the U.S. and the industrialized countries have veto power in the IMF, that if that's all that was determining how these regulations ended up at the end of the day, then they wouldn't look the way that they did, because they're fairly emerging market friendly, much more emerging market friendly than you would expect given the distribution of voting. And that's because of the BRICS coalition.
Okay.
The BRICS coalition, when you add them all up, they have a lot of market power, especially back in 2009, 2010. They were more than half of the world economy. And they had this sort of symbolic legitimacy because this time the crisis didn't start in the emerging markets. It was actually a northern crisis.
Right.
So you add this market power and the legitimacy that they had, plus the fact that they had already a built-in coalition at the IMF because they had just spent the past few years in a battle to try to reform the quotas at the International Monetary Fund. So they had a built-in set of meetings, staffs knew each other, and they did some crafty things to be able to punch above their quota weight at the IMF. I'll mention two of them. One of the things that they did was at the G20 in 2011 at Cannes, when the Europeans asked the BRICS countries to contribute funds to help bail out Greece and some of the other countries affected by the European crisis. The BRICS countries said, oh, let's talk about that. They ultimately didn't give a dime, but they said, let's talk about that. But before we get there, there's a couple things we want to take care of. And one thing that they did was craft a document called the Coherent Conclusions on Managing Capital Flows, done between Brazilians and the Germans, and then signed by all the finance ministers of the G20 and then all the heads of state of the G20. And it said that under surges of capital flows, that countries should reserve the right to do a host of different measures, but also to put in place regulations on cross-border capital flows. Right. That's one thing they did at the G20, which at the G20, a lot of great talk, lots of nice pieces of paper like that, doesn't have a heck of a lot of implementation power. But then that same piece of paper is what the BRICS coalition waved up inside meetings at the IMF when they were negotiating these regulations to be able to say, your countries have already signed on this. If you don't, if you're not consistent with this, then there's an inconsistency here. And so they wedged that in to punch above their quota weight. The other thing that they did is that there's been a revolution in economics. Economists now see that cross-border financial flows are fundamentally volatile and can be financially unstable unless they're regulated. And a lot of the research by economists has actually been done by the IMF research department. And so in addition to taking things like documents from the G20 from the outside into the IMF board to wedge in their coalition building and their politics, they also pointed to piles and piles of IMF studies being done on a different floor and often invited IMF economists to brief the board on their new research that said those countries that regulated were among the least hard hit during the crisis. Those countries that over-deregulated in the 90s didn't grow and were more susceptible to banking crises to help make their case. So for those two reasons, sort of wedging and coalition building and the market power that they had, they were able to punch above their weight.
So where is the U.S. on this question of re-regulation? Are they being helpful or are they opposing it?
The U.S. has many heads, but at the International Monetary Fund, at the end of the day, they endorse these new guidelines on the regulation of capital flows. And many of the economists in the Treasury are top-rate economists who have understood this new thinking. Where one head that hasn't, that's somewhat been left behind on the U.S. is the United States Trade Representative's Office. We think that trade negotiations are about trade, about shirts and cars and toys and things like that, but tariffs on all that stuff is at an all-time low. And what trade agreements are about more these days are about financial services, about intellectual property, about environment, about a whole host of traditional things that we didn't think of as trade. And one of them is monetary policy is really on the negotiating table. And while the Treasury has endorsed these regulations at the International Monetary Fund, at the same time, in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, the United States Treasury is enshrining or working to enshrine mandate that under the treaty there be a free flow of capital among all members, and that any regulation would be in violation of the treaty. Worse, rather than states governing the treaty like they do at the World Trade Organization, the private corporations themselves would be able to regulate that part of the treaty under something called investor-state dispute resolution. Now, there's been a lot of pushback, both inside the United States and by our trading partners. Malaysia and Chile have led the fight at the TPP to try to push back on the United States. 250 economists in the United States signed a letter telling the United States Trade Representative's Office to get its act together. These negotiations aren't done yet, and we hope they square themselves and get on the right side of the issue.
Is there a downside to re-regulation, or are these, genuinely, well-conceived reforms that will bring, in theory at least, or hopefully in practice, stability and predictability to global finance?
In theory, they are the best thing that you can do. In practice, any government can blow any regulation, and sometimes government failures are worse than market failures. But the fundamental difference between sort of now and the 1990s was in the 1990s, the idea in economics was regulating cross-border finance is distortionary for your economy. Right. But what they didn't realize, and the sort of the theoretical breakthroughs that we've had in economics since the 1990s, look at the financial system in the context of what we call information externalities, that they're just not all actors in the financial system have all the information that they need to make the right kind of decisions. Right. And specifically in the term of short-term capital flows, the private investors don't know that perhaps their dollar that they're investing in Brazil might be the one that would cause systemic risk. And clearly all the individual investors that are putting money into a particular country don't know that they're collectively causing systemic risk. Right. And so that inherent market failure due to these information externalities needs to be corrected for markets to work better rather than distorting them. And so there's this sort of new welfare economics of regulating capital flows that says you need to correct markets by putting in place some sort of a tax or a regulation to make the market actually work better and to create better stability and growth, which is quite different than the way folks thought about it in the 90s. Now, the devil's in the details. You have to put in place a strong piece of regulation. Here, the South Koreans have done the best. One, they've come up with a really innovative set of foreign exchange derivative regulations. They're over the counter and for everybody to be able to see. And they have a market where derivatives are what we call deliverable. Brazil has had some interesting regulations that have been modest successes as well, but not so much as the South Koreans, because the Brazilian foreign exchange derivatives market is largely offshore. And offshore is hard to regulate. Right. And so a key message moving forward, you want to have your derivatives markets and your financial markets onshore if you want to regulate them and you want them to work well so that real economy participants can get financing for factories and jobs and so forth. If you just want speculation off the books, then that's what the offshore is about. If you ever want to rein it in, it's much harder to. So India has to be really careful about this as it develops its derivatives market, and China especially as it internationalizes its currency and opens up its financial system in general. They would be much better off if they did this onshore, over-the-counter, in a deliverable manner.
In your view, are there particular gaps in regulatory discussions that just aren't being addressed? Perhaps things like the offshore issues?
Well, offshore issues are a key part of the conversation at the Financial Stability Board. Right. Now we're having many good conversations in many years and very little action. I think one of the big gap that I've been very concerned about that I talk about in the book is that at the G20 countries all said and promised that we would regulate our derivative markets not only with an eye on our own economy, but on making sure that we were in a coordinated manner about it to prevent global systemic risk. Right. And one of the key mistakes that my country made, the United States made, is that we exempted foreign exchange derivatives from the Dodd-Frank bill. The Dodd-Frank bill is our national legislation to try to prevent and mitigate the next crisis. And Secretary Geithner, when he was exempting the foreign exchange derivatives from the bill, said FX derivatives weren't the cause of the crisis in the United States. It was the housing derivatives, right, collateralized debt obligations and so forth, and that worked really well in the United States, and so it's not broke, let's not fix it. That's true if you're not thinking in a G20 world, if you're not thinking in a global world, because it was actually the foreign exchange derivatives market which made a U.S. crisis a global crisis. Much of the problem in Europe is that the balance sheets on many of these derivatives products were through the foreign exchange derivatives markets and sitting in banks in Europe and in Brazil and in South Korea and across the world. And so by regulating the foreign exchange derivative market in the United States, that would be a way that the U.S. could regulate capital flows on its end. Going back to John Maynard Keynes at the original Bretton Woods conference, there's lots of disagreement at that conference, but one of the core things that both Britain and the United States agreed on is that when you regulate capital flows, that they should be regulated at both ends.
Right.
It's tough for Brazil to regulate, even if they didn't have offshore, because there's just high technology these days and such an onslaught of investment coming from the north. If the U.S. also regulated, they would have less speculation in foreign exchange market when they had the low interest rates and more investment into new factories and new restaurants, which is what the intent of the low interest rates was to begin with.
So where is this going? Are you optimistic that re-regulation is possible?
Well, re-regulation has happened. I think we've taken one big step forward after this crisis, and I hope it doesn't take another crisis to take another step forward. Hopefully there's enough collective memory about what's happened to help us continue to move forward. The tailwinds in the world economy are changing now. The United States is returning as the engine of the economy, and the world economy, and interest rates are starting to go up in the United States.
Right.
China is slowing down, and subsequently the commodities price is slowing down. Those forces and the fact that Europe continues to shoot itself in the foot are making capital flows again retreat from emerging markets back into the developed world. And this is a real problem because regulating capital flows on the way in is much more effective than trying to regulate them while they're retreating out the door. And so there's a lot of financial instability in the system right now, and it's really going to have to be a globally agreed upon solution. And I'm not as optimistic that there's enough salience about these issues here in 2015 as there was in 2008 and 2009.
Right. Well, on that pessimistic note, Kevin, it's been wonderful having you. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for joining us, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
And thank you to our audience for watching. You've been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter.
To come in and out. And also due to some hard work of, say, U.S. congresspersons and some non-governmental organizations, because of course the U.S. has veto power and was largely behind the move until the last minute. Right. So fast forward to 2008, 2009, when the crisis hit in the United States and in New York. Right. Ironically, there was so much fear in the world markets that money retreated from everywhere in the world and came back to the United States. Seems odd, but we do hold the dollar, and we, knock on wood, have never defaulted on our loans. Right. And the United States was seen as a safe haven for global financial markets. And they will grow. Economies absorb the investment, and they would be able to put it to full use. And so any kind of regulation on the cross-border transactions of financial flows was considered inherently distortionary, that would hurt the economy. If they even worked. A lot of folks didn't even think that they worked. And that was the dominant paradigm in the 1990s, so much so that there was a move at the International Monetary Fund to actually require that every country in the world open up its financial flows to the rest of the world. That stopped because of the Asian financial crisis, which was largely a function of premature opening of capital accounts, the section of your balance of payments that allows financial flow.
Every week on the show, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of external affairs here to the studio in Waterloo. Today, my guest is Dr. Kevin Gallagher. Dr. Gallagher is an associate professor of global development policy at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. He's also the co-director of the Global Economic Governance Initiative and the Global Development Policy Programs. He's also the author of a new book that came out in 2014, published by Cornell University Press, Ruling Capital, Emerging Markets, and the Re-Regulation of Cross-Border Finance. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the book. And I thought we'd start by setting the landscape. Going back to 2000. Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Kevin Gallagher on the subject of global financial regulation. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. 2008-2009, what was the regulatory framework governing global finance like?
Well, I want to go back even a little further than that to the 1990s, where the dominant way of thinking in the economic profession, which was mimicked at the International Monetary Fund and other international financial institutions, was that cross-border financial flows, derivatives, bonds, stocks, and so forth, bank loans, and so forth, were essential for the development of emerging market and developing economies. We didn't call them emerging markets then, we just called them developing economies. Because emerging markets or developing economies were developing essentially because they didn't have enough investment. And if they opened up their doors to investment, the idea at the time was let it flow